The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Miller ranch house, and Samuel Miller stood there with his coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the dust rise from the distant road, and he knew someone was coming, though. He could not yet make out who it might be, and in his 63 years he had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought simple news. His wife Martha had been gone now for 2 years, and the silence of the house behind him felt heavier on mornings like this, when memories seemed to whisper through every room in the ranch that had once bustled with the sounds of family and workers, now held only him and old Thomas, who helped with the horses and barely spoke a dozen words each day. The figure on the road grew closer, and Samuel could see it was a woman walking, not riding, and she moved with difficulty as though each step required great effort, and something in her posture spoke of desperation that made his chest tighten with an old familiar ache of wanting to help but fearing what help might cost. When she finally reached the gate, she stopped and looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much hardship, and her dress was torn at the hem and covered in the dust of long travel, and she was young. Samuel thought perhaps 30 or so, though hard living had carved lines around her eyes that made her seem older. She opened her mouth to speak, but at first no words came, and Samuel watched her struggle with whatever pride or fear held her voice captive, and then finally she managed to say in a voice barely above a whisper that she needed help and that she had nowhere else to go. Samuel did not move at first because he was thinking of Martha and how she would have already been down those steps with water and kind words, and how she would have known exactly what to do, while he stood here feeling clumsy with compassion and uncertain of the right response. But then he saw the woman sway slightly as though she might fall, and that broke through his hesitation, and he set down his coffee and walked down the steps slowly so as not to startle her. And he asked her name. She said it was Eleanor, and that she had been traveling for 6 days, and that her husband had died of fever 3 months past, and she had lost their small farm when she could not pay the debts he had left behind. And she had a son, but he was with her sister 2 towns over, because she could not feed him while she searched for work. Samuel listened and did not interrupt, though questions formed in his mind about why she had come here to his remote ranch, where he rarely hired help and had little need for another hand. But those questions could wait, because right now what mattered was the woman before him, who looked as though she might collapse at any moment. He told her to come inside, and she hesitated, looking up at the house as though it were a mansion instead of a simple ranch dwelling. And she said she did not want charity, only work and a chance to earn her keep. And Samuel nodded and said they could discuss that. But first she needed water and food and rest. Inside the house felt too quiet, as it always did, and Samuel busied himself with putting together a simple meal of bread and cold chicken and milk, while Eleanor sat at the table with her hands folded in her lap, looking around with eyes that took in the dust on the mantel and the dishes in the sink and the general disorder of a man living alone without purpose. She ate slowly and carefully, as though she had not had a proper meal in some time, and Samuel watched her and thought about how easy it was to fall through the cracks of life, and how close any of them might be to desperation if circumstances shifted just slightly. When she had finished eating, he asked her what kind of work she could do, and she listed tasks with quiet determination, saying she could cook and clean and mend and work with chickens and tend a garden. And she did not mention her exhaustion or the obvious pain in her feet from walking so far. Samuel considered this, and he thought about the house that Martha would have been ashamed to see in its current state, and about the meals he barely bothered to make for himself, and about the loneliness that had become so familiar. He barely noticed it anymore. He told Eleanor she could stay for a trial period of 2 weeks, and if the arrangement worked for both of them, they could discuss something more permanent. And he would pay her fairly, and she could have the small room off the kitchen that had once been used by their ranch cook years ago when they had employed several people. Eleanor looked at him with tears starting in her eyes, and she began to say something that sounded like it would be thanks or perhaps a plea for understanding. And Samuel held up his hand and said simply that everyone deserved a chance, and that he expected honest work and nothing more. That first day, Eleanor moved through the house like a quiet shadow, and Samuel left her to it and went out to work with the horses, and when he came back in the evening, the kitchen was clean, and there was a hot meal waiting, and the simple comfort of it made his throat tight over the following Days a pattern emerged, and Eleanor worked with steady determination and asked for nothing beyond what they had agreed upon. And slowly the house began to feel less abandoned and more like a home again, though neither of them spoke much beyond practical necessities. Samuel noticed small things like how she had mended the curtain in the front room that had been torn for a year, and how she had organized the pantry, and how there were fresh flowers in a jar on the table, though he had not asked for any of these things. On the 5th day, while they were eating supper in the quiet way they had established, Samuel asked about her son, and Eleanor's face changed, becoming both softer and more pained, and she spoke of a boy named James who was 7, and loved horses, and liked to draw pictures of birds. She said she hoped to bring him to the ranch soon if Samuel did not mind, and that she would make sure he did not cause any trouble. And Samuel thought of his own children who were grown now and scattered to distant cities, and how empty the house had felt without young voices. He told her the boy would be welcome, and that there was plenty of room, and that a ranch was a good place for a child to learn about responsibility and life, and Eleanor looked at him with such gratitude that he had to look away. The 2nd week passed, and the trial period ended, and Samuel told Eleanor she could stay as long as she needed, and that he would pay her a fair wage, and she could bring her son whenever she was ready. And she accepted with simple dignity. When James arrived, he was small for 7, with his mother's dark eyes, and a quietness that suggested he had learned not to expect much from the world, and Samuel watched him explore the ranch with cautious wonder and felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died with Martha. The boy took to the horses immediately, and Samuel found himself teaching him small things about how to approach them, and how to read their moods, and how to be patient and gentle. And James listened with intense focus and asked thoughtful questions. Eleanor flourished in a way that Samuel had not expected, and the tight lines around her mouth eased, and she began to smile occasionally, and the house filled with sounds of cooking and cleaning and sometimes soft singing. And Samuel realized he had not known how much he missed these signs of life. But then came the day when a man arrived on horseback asking questions about a woman and a boy, and Samuel felt his stomach drop because he knew immediately why the man had come. Even before the stranger explained that Eleanor owed money to some people back east, and that her late husband had borrowed from the wrong men. The stranger was polite, but firm, and he said that Eleanor needed to settle the debt or return with him to face the consequences. And Samuel asked how much was owed, and the number was staggering, far more than a ranch hand could ever earn, even in years of work. Eleanor stood in the doorway holding James close, and her face had gone pale, and all the progress she had made seemed to crumble away as she shrank back into that desperate woman who had first appeared on the road. Samuel looked at her, and then at the boy, and then at the stranger, and he thought about justice and mercy, and about how the world ground down good people, and about what Martha would have done if she were here. He told the stranger to wait, and he went inside to his study and opened the locked drawer where he kept his important papers and the money he had been saving, though he was not entirely sure what he had been saving it for, and he counted out the full amount that Eleanor owed. When he came back outside, the stranger was still there, and Eleanor was crying silently. And Samuel handed over the money and told the man that the debt was settled, and that Eleanor and her son were under his protection now, and the stranger counted the bills and nodded and rode away. Eleanor could not speak at first, and when she finally found words, she began to say that she would pay him back every penny, and that she would work for however long it took. And Samuel held up his hand again in that gesture that had become familiar between them. He told her that some debts were meant to be forgiven, and that what mattered now was that she and James were safe, and that they had a home here for as long as they needed it, and that the money had been sitting idle anyway. And what good was wealth if it could not be used to help someone in need? Eleanor wept then in earnest, and James held on to her, and Samuel felt awkward standing there witnessing such raw emotion. But he also felt something else, a sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for a long time. In the months that followed, the